Everyone thinks they know where the fall begins. Heavenly beings look down, descend, take human women, and the world moves toward violence and judgment. But open the ancient sources side by side, and the first moment of responsibility refuses to stay in one place. In one text, guilt appears inside a compressed sequence of seeing, taking, and union. In another, the same descent begins under a constructive mission. In a third, the actors speak their plan aloud, recognize the danger, and bind themselves together before the deed. This episode applies a simple comparison tool, the moral timeline test. It is not an ancient category, and no ancient writer uses that name. It asks each source one disciplined question. Within its own sequence, what is the first culpable intention, commitment, or action the text actually supplies? The question sounds simple. It is not, because ancient stories often show responsibility taking shape rather than announcing the precise instant when sin begins. Think of the test as a sequence chart. We mark 4 possible stages: the first charged precursor, the first explicit intention, the first binding commitment, and the first enacted transgression. Intention is not the same as a promise. A promise is not the same as an act. And an action narrated by a text is not automatically labeled by that text as the first sin. We will therefore distinguish what is stated, what is analytically inferred, and what is not stated. There are 3 source lanes. Genesis gives a brief and difficult account of the sons of God and the daughters of humanity. Jubilees gives the watchers a constructive mission before their failure. The Book of Watchers gives desire, proposal, fear, oath, unions, and differentiated instruction. They share a skeleton, but not a single moral architecture. The story lives in the sequence: who wanted what, when, and what they did about it. The rule is strict. Later detail may illuminate how a tradition developed, but it cannot silently fill an earlier text. Whenever a familiar element is missing, we will say not stated. That marker does not imply erasure, censorship, or secret suppression. It marks the edge of the page, the place where the source stops speaking and later imagination begins. Empty cells remain empty. They are not invitations to borrow from another column. A name from one book cannot be smuggled into another. An oath sworn in one lane cannot be assumed in a lane that never mentions it. This discipline can feel austere because the later tradition is vivid. But vivid details colonize memory, and memory can make for compressed verses seem to contain an entire later drama. The viewer's task is not to memorize 3 summaries. It is to watch responsibility take shape through 3 different narrative designs. Genesis reports compressed action. Jubilees turns entrusted service into failure. The Book of Watchers exposes intention before enactment. Their differences are not noise around one true story. They are the evidence. Begin with Genesis 6, verses 1 to 4. Humanity multiplies, and daughters are born. The male figures are called sons of God. Genesis does not call them watchers. That later name may be familiar, but using it here would already import another source's vocabulary into the Genesis lane. The sequence begins with sight. The sons of God see that the daughters of humanity are attractive. The line carries moral weight because of what follows, but Genesis does not condemn seeing by itself. It does not pause to name desire, explain motive, or rank the stages of guilt. There is no inner monologue, no confession, no narrator telling us what these figures privately intend. Then the language sharpens. They take wives from all whom they choose. This is not a neutral courtship summary. It presents selection and taking, perception hardening into appropriation. For the moral timeline test, this is the strongest analytical candidate for the culpable threshold in Genesis, though the text itself never calls it the first sin. Genesis then refers to sexual union and offspring. The union completes the transgressive complex that begins with seeing and moves through taking. Yet the passage does not tell us whether the decisive boundary lies in the gaze, the taking, the union, or the whole sequence considered together. Now mark the absences. A prior teaching mission is not stated in Genesis. A collective oath on Hermon is not stated. The names Shemahaza and Asael are not stated. A catalog of forbidden arts is not stated. These are not minor omissions. They define what Genesis can and cannot answer. The identity of the sons of God remains interpretive. Genesis supplies the phrase and the action sequence, but the passage itself does not settle every later debate about who these figures are. Our task is narrower: to track responsibility without pretending the text gives explanations it does not give. This method can feel severe because the later tradition is unforgettable. Names, oaths, mountains, and forbidden skills attach themselves easily to Genesis in the imagination. A detail repeated in sermons, art, novels, or online videos may feel ancient and universal even when it belongs to another source. Repetition strengthens memory. It does not strengthen evidence. Genesis also places divine speech and the reference to the Nephilim within this compressed passage, but neither element supplies the missing stages needed for a fuller culpability map. We should not use consequence or judgment context to invent a prior commission, named conspiracy, or teaching program. The test stays with the sequence the passage actually narrates. 3 candidates now stand before us. First, seeing, the earliest morally charged precursor. Second, taking wives, the first overt action. Third, union, the enacted completion of the sequence. Genesis narrates all 3, but it does not explicitly rank them. Calling the site alone the first sin would exceed the wording. Calling the union the only meaningful offense would erase the force of the taking that precedes it. The most responsible conclusion is therefore analytical and limited. Taking wives is the strongest threshold candidate, while union completes the transgressive complex. This distinction protects the story from 2 opposite errors. One error makes the text say too much by inserting an explicit moral label. The other makes it say too little by turning the sequence into an ordinary romance. Genesis is brief, but its brevity is not moral neutrality. The result is not a universal answer. It is the Genesis answer, bounded by Genesis. There is no mission to failure arc here because no mission is stated. There is no oath threshold because no oath is stated. To find those elements, we must change sources and announce the transition. The phrase strongest analytical candidate is deliberately restrained. It means the taking is the earliest narrated deed that crosses from perception into appropriation. It does not mean every interpreter must define culpability at precisely that point, and it does not erase the union that follows. The conclusion is a reasoned reading, not an ancient marginal note. The Genesis lane, therefore, ends with a disciplined tension. Something clearly consequential has happened. Yet the text withholds the interior stages that later traditions will supply. Its brevity is not moral neutrality. It is a compressed architecture in which action carries more weight than explained motive. The honest conclusion is not that Genesis has no answer, but that its answer must remain narrower than the answers available elsewhere. Jubilees opens a different moral timeline. In Jubilees 4:15, the Watchers descend to earth with a stated purpose: to teach humanity judgment and uprightness and to act justly. Their descent is not introduced as rebellion. It is entrusted service. That single sentence moves the moral starting point and changes the genre of the story. In Genesis, no prior commission is stated. In Jubilees, the first movement is neither forbidden knowledge nor illicit desire. It is a mission. Once that is visible, every later act is measured against the role these beings were given at the start. The story becomes not an invasion from the first moment, but a tragedy of corrupted vocation. The boundary must be explicit. Jubilees does not state that God commissioned sexual unions. It does not state that God sent the Watchers to teach forbidden arts. Calling their entire teaching mission corrupt would reverse the source's own sequence and erase the contrast on which its moral drama depends. This also changes how knowledge functions. The problem cannot be knowledge as such, because the mission involves teaching justice and uprightness. The moral question becomes one of authority, purpose, timing, and fidelity. Who teaches what, under whose commission, and when does the entrusted role become a violation? The first major payoff of the moral timeline test is now visible. The same descent that popular retellings often treat as the beginning of the fall is not culpable in Jubilees. The fall begins later. Mission precedes failure. A mission to failure story creates a sharper tragedy. The actors are not introduced only as intruders arriving with a corrupt program. They are entrusted with a good task and then violate the order they were meant to uphold. The distance between commission and conduct becomes part of the indictment. The teachers of uprightness become the breakers of the boundary. The constructive commission is not permission to harmonize every later action back into God's purpose. A good assignment does not sanctify its betrayal. Jubilees can present the descent positively and the later unions negatively without contradiction, because the moral change occurs in what the Watchers do after arriving. Jubilees 5 moves from commission to transgression. The Watchers see the daughters of humanity and take human wives. Here the taking is the first explicit failure after the constructive mission. No imported oath is needed to make the turn legible. The commission itself supplies the standard, and the later act betrays it. The moral shape is sharper than in Genesis because the earlier commission supplies a standard against which the later act can be judged. These figures were sent to teach uprightness and act justly. They then cross a boundary through unions with human women. Responsibility is measured against a role they were given. Jubilees later looks back on this conduct and labels the sexual transgression more explicitly. In the retrospective speech of chapter 7, the unions are described as fornication and transgression. That later moral language confirms the seriousness of the act, but it should not be treated as a verbatim repetition of chapter 5. The Herman oath is not stated in this Jubilees sequence. An explicit collective plan before the taking is not stated. A differentiated list of illicit teachings at this point is not stated. The source gives a mission to failure arc, not the same prehistory found in the Book of Watchers. The threshold decision is therefore source-specific. In Jubilees, the descent and teaching mission are non-culpable, seeing functions as narrative setup. Taking human wives is the first explicit failure in the main sequence, and the later retrospective moralizes the unions. This is the first great reversal produced by the test. The same descent that many retellings treat as the rebellion itself is not culpable in Jubilees. Mission precedes failure. The fall begins not at the border between heaven and earth, but when entrusted agents cross the boundary around their task. The tragedy lies in betrayal from within, not merely danger arriving from outside. Retrospective language must be handled in its own time position. A later speech can interpret earlier events and sharpen their moral meaning, but it does not erase the earlier narrative form. By keeping Chapter 5 and Chapter 7 distinct, we can hear both the event sequence and the source's later judgment on that sequence. Jubilees 7:24, 25 requires special care because it is easily blended with another tradition. The passage speaks of violence against living creatures, extensive bloodshed, and destruction. It belongs to a retrospective account of corruption and consequence. What it does not provide is equally important. Charms are not stated in these verses. Spells are not stated. Root cutting is not stated. A named curriculum of forbidden arts is not stated. Those details belong to the Book of Watchers Lane, not to this Jubilees passage. This is more than a technical correction. If illicit teaching is inserted here, the moral timeline changes. The first failure begins to look like a corrupted educational program, when Jubilees has instead foregrounded unlawful unions and the violent disorder that follows. The violence is consequence evidence, not a new first threshold. It shows the widening field of harm. The failure does not remain private or isolated. Yet the text still does not authorize us to turn every later evil into the content of the original mission. Jubilees therefore preserves a disciplined contrast. The Watchers are sent for justice and uprightness. They take wives. Their conduct is later condemned, and violence spreads. The constructive mission and the destructive aftermath must remain separated if the source's moral argument is to remain intact. The temptation to merge the catalogs is understandable. Once several ancient accounts are read together, a compact synthesis feels efficient. Yet efficiency can produce a false quotation in the viewer's mind. A detail remembered from one book begins to sound as though it was printed in another. The not-stated marker interrupts that drift. A second control appears in the figure of Enoch. In Jubilees, Enoch is portrayed positively as a learner, recorder, scribe, and witness. He receives knowledge, records signs, and instructs within an honored ancestral frame. If knowledge itself were the crime, Enoch would stand among the guilty. He does not. In the Book of Watchers, Enoch again functions positively, this time as scribe, intermediary, and messenger of judgment. He carries words between the human world and the heavenly court. The texts never equate his knowledge with the Watcher's illicit disclosures. Enoch becomes the control case. Knowledge under authority is not the same as knowledge embedded in violation. This prevents a crude conclusion that heavenly or specialist knowledge is inherently evil. The sources themselves distinguish lawful learning and witness from transgressive disclosure. The question is not simply whether information passes from heaven to earth. The deeper issue is moral authorization. A constructive commission can be betrayed. A skill can be taught within a network of violation. A witness can receive knowledge without becoming identical to the offenders he addresses. The timeline test therefore tracks not only acts, but roles. This unit also sets a limit. We will not invent Enoch's private thoughts, imagined conversations, or emotional reactions. His narrative function is strong enough without reconstruction. He stands as a lawful recorder and judgment messenger within source worlds where other knowledge has become culpable. This distinction also protects the episode from a sensational formula in which civilization itself is treated as contamination. The approved evidence permits a narrower claim. Some disclosures are embedded in a transgressive sequence, while other learning and testimony are presented positively. The moral category is not culture versus ignorance, but authorized service versus violation. The contrast between Enoch and the Watchers also protects the episode from a simplistic suspicion of civilization. Writing, learning, technical skill, and revealed knowledge are not condemned as one contaminated category. The sources ask a more demanding question, whether a gift, office, or body of knowledge remains aligned with its proper purpose. The issue is not possession of knowledge, but fidelity in its use. The Book of Watchers begins its culpability sequence with far greater psychological detail. The Watchers see and desire human women, and desire becomes a collective proposal. They will choose wives and beget children. Here the earliest culpable intention is not reconstructed backward from a deed. It is spoken aloud before enactment. Shemahaza then fears that the others may refuse, and that he alone will bear the penalty of a great sin. The line does not reveal every private motive, but it marks awareness of wrongdoing and anticipated consequence before the act occurs. He sees the danger, names the sin, and still allows the plan to stand. This matters because the oath is often treated as the beginning. In the Book of Watchers, intent precedes oath. The plan already exists, and fear already recognizes moral danger. The oath will not create desire or invent the proposal. It will turn a known plan into shared commitment and make retreat more difficult. The righteous teaching mission of Jubilees is not stated in this portion of the Book of Watchers. We cannot import it to create a tragic fall from an assigned educational task. This lane supplies a different prehistory: desire, proposal, fear, and collective commitment. The second major payoff is now visible. Genesis gives an analytical threshold because motive is not explained. Jubilees gives a mission to failure threshold. The Book of Watchers gives an explicit intention before enactment. The sources converge on transgression while arranging responsibility differently. Notice how much more explicit this lane is about culpability awareness. The plan is verbalized, and the fear of penalty appears before the deed. We do not need to invent a secret motive or dramatize a private counsel. The source already supplies a progression from desire to proposal and from proposal to acknowledged danger. This sequence also keeps blame where the text places agency. The women do not convene the group, formulate the proposal, or impose the oath. Whatever questions remain about the unions, the initiating plan belongs to the watchers. That boundary matters whenever later retellings turn the daughters of humanity into the cause of the entire fall. The group agrees to bind itself by oath and mutual imprecation. The oath transforms a proposal into a collective and binding commitment. Responsibility becomes shared before the transgression is enacted. Fear, instead of stopping the group, produces a mechanism of solidarity that reinforces the wrong decision. The sequence is precise: desire, proposal, fear, oath, dissent, union, instruction. Each stage adds moral weight. The proposal names the intended act. Fear acknowledges penalty. The oath seals shared liability. Dissent carries the committed plan toward execution. Unions enact it. Differentiated instruction widens the field of culpability. This oath belongs to the Book of Watchers Lane. It is not stated in Genesis. It is not stated in the Jubilees sequence we have examined. Calling it the universal first fall would collapse three different timelines into one harmonized narrative. The oath is therefore best described as the first collective binding commitment in the Book of Watchers, not as the first culpable thought, and not as the first enacted transgression. Those distinctions may sound narrow, but they reveal the source's moral psychology. Wrongdoing here develops through escalation. An attraction becomes a proposal. A proposal meets fear. Fear does not stop the group. It leads to a mechanism of solidarity. The oath turns shared desire into shared liability. Collective commitment does not dissolve individual agency. The oath binds the participants together, but it does not turn them into one mind. Its force lies in coordination. Each member's choice is strengthened by the choices of the others. No one is merely swept along. Shared liability becomes the engine that drives the plan forward. The oath is therefore chilling not because it is magical, but because it formalizes moral failure. The group has already imagined the act and already recognized its danger. Instead of using fear as a reason to stop, they use commitment as a way to prevent stopping. The mechanism is recognizable far beyond this ancient story. People can build structures that make a wrong choice feel inevitable after it has already been chosen. After commitment comes enactment. The watchers take wives and defile themselves. The plan is no longer contemplated or pledged, it is carried out. The unions form one major strand of the transgressive complex. A second strand follows through illicit instruction. The Book of Watchers links the unions with teachings that are differentiated among named figures. It does not present one anonymous teacher delivering one undivided curriculum. Asael, also represented by the name form Azazel in transmission and translation, is especially associated with weapons, metalwork, and ornamentation. Other named watchers receive other teaching functions. The exact name forms and wording can vary, so attribution must remain controlled. Shemahaza and Asael must not be collapsed. Shemahaza is associated with leadership, fear, collective agreement, oath, and dissent. Asael is associated with particular arts and a distinct judgment trajectory. The narrative later differentiates their judgments as well as their functions. This is why the first culpable act cannot be reduced to forbidden teaching alone. Desire and plan precede the oath. The oath precedes dissent. Unions enact the plan. Differentiated instruction adds further culpable acts. The source constructs a layered sequence, not a single isolated offense. Women are not the initiating causal class in this plan. The watchers formulate the proposal, anticipate penalty, bind themselves, descend, take wives, and teach. The account may raise difficult questions about gender and power, but it does not support transferring primary causal responsibility to the women. The instruction material must also be narrated without treating every craft as self-evidently wicked in every context. The text places these teachings inside its own account of defilement and disorder. Our wording follows that narrative judgment without claiming that metalwork, ornament, or technical knowledge is universally evil outside the source's moral frame. Later judgment reinforces the separation of roles. The source does not treat Shemahaza and Asael as interchangeable labels for one villain. Their functions and judgment trajectories differ. Preserving that distinction prevents a familiar narrative shortcut from becoming a factual collapse. Texts do not reach us as disembodied ideas. They survive through witnesses, catalogs, copies, fragments, translations, and institutional records. The manuscripts matter because they show that these traditions were copied and transmitted in antiquity. They do not decide the moral timeline test for us, and they do not convert literary narration into a photograph of events. Official records identify separate Enoch-related entries, including 4Q201 for Q202 and 4Q204. Official records also identify Jubilees-related entries, including 4Q216 for Q217, for Q219, for Q220, and 11Q12, with the tentative character of one catalog attribution preserved where the record itself is tentative. A digitized Guizi manuscript witness containing Enoch also survives in Manchester. That is a concrete transmission fact. It does not make the Ethiopic manuscript an original copy, and it does not by itself settle the composition, earliest wording, authorship, or historical truth of the narrative. The distinct catalog entries must not be imagined as one complete original manuscript. Their presence establishes survival and transmission at the level supported by the records. Unsupported claims about language, date, material, exact find site, extent, or completeness remain withheld unless separately documented. Manuscript presence or manuscript count does not by itself establish canonical status. A text may circulate, be copied, be valued, or survive without those facts alone proving that every community treated it as scripture. Transmission and canon are related questions, but they are not identical. This evidence matters because it disciplines both skepticism and enthusiasm. The traditions are not modern inventions without witnesses, but the witnesses do not authorize every conclusion later readers may wish to draw. They establish presence and transmission, not an unlimited verdict about authorship, original wording, canon, or historical truth. Catalog discipline may sound less dramatic than a complete scroll revealed from the earth, but it is more truthful. A record can identify a witness while withholding many details viewers expect. Responsible narration preserves that asymmetry. We say what the institution's record supports, and we refuse to decorate the object with unverified properties. The manuscript section therefore has a narrow purpose in this episode. It confirms that these literary traditions have distinct transmission witnesses and institutional records. It does not decide the moral timeline test for us. The threshold analysis still rests on the controlled passages, not on the mere number or fame of surviving witnesses. Catalog discipline may feel less dramatic than the discovery of one complete secret book, but it is more truthful. A witness can be real, ancient, and important while still leaving major questions unresolved. The fragment proves that a text existed in material history. It does not automatically prove the event narrated, the authority claimed, or the interpretation later attached to it. Now place the three timelines side by side. In Genesis, seeing is the earliest charged precursor, taking wives is the strongest analytical threshold candidate, and union completes the sequence. Explicit intention, prior mission, and oath are not stated. In Jubilees, descent to teach justice and uprightness is a positive commission. Taking human wives is the first explicit failure after that mission. The later retrospective condemns the unions and describes violence, bloodshed, and destruction. The Herman Oath and a pre-taking collective plan are not stated. In the Book of Watchers, desire becomes a spoken proposal. Fear marks awareness of penalty. The oath binds the group. Dissent carries the plan toward enactment. Unions realize it, and differentiated instruction adds further offenses. A prior righteous teaching mission is not stated in this lane. The shared core is real. The sources connect heavenly figures, human women, unions, and destructive consequences. But the moral prehistory differs. Genesis is compressed. Jubilees builds a mission-to-failure arc. The Book of Watchers expands intention, commitment, enactment, and disclosure. A later source can show reception, reinterpretation, or narrative development. It cannot prove that missing words once stood in an earlier source. Absence of mission language in Genesis is not evidence of suppression. It is a boundary that keeps comparison honest. The moral timeline test, therefore, does not ask which source should be forced to contain the others. It asks what each source makes morally visible. Comparison becomes strongest when similarity and difference are allowed to stand together. Comparison now produces a convergence without flattening. All three lanes make the taking or union morally central, but only one gives a prior constructive mission, and only one explicitly stages plan, fear, and oath. The agreement tells us where the traditions meet. The disagreement tells us how each tradition explains responsibility. The method also guards against false certainty created by familiarity. A detail repeated in art, sermons, novels, or online videos may feel ancient and universal even when it belongs to one textual lane. Repetition can strengthen memory without strengthening evidence. The comparison restores evidence to its proper source. What, then, is the first culpable act? There is no single answer that can be lifted from one source and imposed on all three. Genesis supports taking wives as the strongest analytical threshold candidate, with union completing the complex. Jubilees identifies the taking of wives as failure after a constructive mission. The Book of Watchers locates culpability earlier, in explicit intention, before oath and enactment. The result is not uncertainty for its own sake. It is a more exact account of responsibility. Mission, intention, commitment, and action are different moral stages. A source that includes all four can distinguish them. A source that includes only some of them cannot be made to testify to the rest. Several popular claims remain outside the evidence. A coordinated suppression campaign is not stated by these primary lanes. DNA, pure bloodline, or genetic quarantine is not stated. Extraterrestrial or advanced technology origins are not stated. Source silence cannot be converted into proof of any of them. Giants, the flood, later spirits, mastema, calendar debates, canon, and broad reception history belong mainly to downstream questions. They matter, but expanding them here would consume the space reserved for PFA 014 and other episodes. In this investigation, they remain consequence context. The responsible ending is therefore disciplined, but not bloodless. Genesis gives the brief sequence. Jubilees turns entrusted service into failure. The Book of Watchers exposes plan, fear, oath, enactment, and differentiated teaching. One lane begins with compressed action. One begins with a good commission betrayed. One begins with a plan spoken aloud before a single boundary is crossed. When we keep the lanes separate, the moral timeline becomes clearer. The earliest text does not become empty because it is brief. The later texts do not become mere decoration because they are fuller. Each source answers a different part of the question, and each must be allowed to stop where its words stop. The convergence is real, but it is not uniformity. All three sources make taking or union morally central. Only Jubilees gives a constructive mission before failure. Only the Book of Watchers gives explicit intention, fear, and oath before enactment. Genesis remains compressed. The similarities show a shared tradition. The differences show how each text understood the growth of responsibility. This conclusion changes how we read silence. Silence is not emptiness waiting for a theory. It is a limit on what a source can establish. Saying not stated may feel less satisfying than supplying a hidden cause, but it prevents possibility from becoming history and later reception from masquerading as earlier wording. The test finally returns responsibility to sequence. Mission, intention, commitment, and action are different moral stages. The moral drama does not weaken when those stages are separated. It sharpens because each stage carries only the weight its own source can bear. Responsible comparison is not the refusal to conclude. It is the refusal to make one source speak with another source's mouth. The answer is firm where the sequences are firm, qualified where the ranking is analytical, and silent where the texts are silent. That restraint is not weakness. It is precisely what makes the verdict worth trusting.